Welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys had a great break. Got some tea, some coffee, some soda, whatever it is, because we're gonna have some more fun. We have our Living with Glaucoma segment moderated by Dr. David Richardson, another great friend of mine. Dr. Richardson received his medical degree from Harvard Medical School and completed his ophthalmology residency at Doheny Eye Institute, the University of Southern California, and LA County Hospital. He is currently a glaucoma specialist at San Marino Eye in Southern California. Dr. Richardson will also be joined by Dr. Alicia Donahue. She is the assistant professor of optometry at the New England's College of Optometry with a focus on low vision rehabilitation. James Knoll is a chronic illness psychologist who has also lost much of his eyesight due to a rare retinal condition. Nina Valtierra, the wife of our very own Richie Kahn, and Tracy Hammond, who was born with congenital glaucoma and has been through multiple treatments to preserve his vision. Welcome, everybody. Enjoy.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to start this session with a talk on low vision rehabilitation in glaucoma by Dr. Alicia Donahue. Ali, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I apologize in advance. I'm a little bit hoarse because my little one brought home a cold this week, but I'm so excited to be here and talk to all of you. So I wanted to start by talking about what is low vision. Low vision is vision loss that we cannot correct with medical treatment, surgical treatment, eyeglasses, or contact lenses. And low vision rehabilitation, or what I practice in the Boston area, is a multidisciplinary approach to improving visual function when we can't improve vision with those treatments I just mentioned. And a lot of our focus is on maintaining independence and helping our patients do the things they want to do with their current level of vision. Now, there are many members in the low vision team. There's the low vision optometrist, but we also work with low vision therapists, occupational therapists, orientation and mobility specialists. For our students, we work with teachers of students with visual impairments. And then we are often coordinating with psychology, psychiatry, internal medicine, local agencies in Massachusetts. That's the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind and the Mass Association of the Blind and Visually Impaired. And of course, our ophthalmology colleagues. And one thing I really want to emphasize here is that many studies demonstrate that visual function is improved, and as is independence and quality of life, by patients that receive low vision rehabilitation services, making it very important for almost every patient with glaucoma. I also wanted to mention that according to the American Academy of Ophthalmology, they recommend referring or providing yourself low vision services to any patient with any functional vision difficulty. This can include reduced visual acuity of 20/40 or worse, any central or peripheral vision loss or distortion, any reduced contrast sensitivity, or anyone that's having trouble doing something with their vision. And so in my eyes, almost every glaucoma patient can benefit from low vision rehabilitation. So what are some visual symptoms and changes we see in glaucoma? One is contrast sensitivity loss. And so basically that's the threshold between what's visible and invisible, or the ability to see things as they get progressively dimmer. And glaucoma results in much more reduction in contrast sensitivity than we typically see as the eye matures with age. And so when there's reduced contrast sensitivity, it can make it very hard to see some things that are not bold. So one example is a newspaper, as you see in our middle photo. Newspapers are often, a gray background and the text is gray instead of dark black on white. And so in glaucoma, that's a lot more difficult to read than it might be in patients that don't have glaucoma. Additionally, on dim or dreary days, like the picture in the bottom left, the contrast is poorer. So anybody that has contrast sensitivity loss will have a harder time navigating than on a brighter, bolder, sunnier day. This picture you see on the bottom right, or over here, this chart, this is a test that I use in the office to measure contrast sensitivity called the Mars Contrast Sensitivity Test. And what you see is the letters get progressively dimmer. And this helps us know how dim something can be before it becomes more difficult for someone to see. Now, one of the more common visual symptoms people are familiar with in glaucoma is visual field loss. And the most common presentation is peripheral visual field loss that slowly comes in and then affects the central vision. Additionally, patients can sometimes have what we call paracentral defects or visual field loss right next to their fixation or exactly where they're looking. And so this is another visual symptom that affects function in glaucoma. And then we can also have visual acuity loss. And visual acuity is the ability to see fine detail. And this is the test where they're measuring on multiple charts in the clinic to see what the smallest letter you can see. And in end-stage glaucoma, this is also affected. One thing I want to point out here and why contrast sensitivity or the ability to see things as they become dimmer is so important is because in visual acuity, we're always testing this with a black letter on a white background. So really high contrast, really bold. And so you may be able to see a lot lower on one of these charts, but then in the real world, not everything's black on white. And so that's why with contrast, as things get dimmer, you may not be able to see as small of letters or as small of targets as you're functioning in your daily life. Now, what can you expect from a low vision rehabilitation exam that might be different than some of your other eye exams? We'll still check your pressure. We'll still take a look at the health of the eye, the front of the eye, and we'll still, talk to your ophthalmologist and your glaucoma specialist. But other things that might be new in this exam would be a very detailed functional history, going over all the things you're doing in your daily life and how your vision might be affecting them. We'll also take some extra functional vision measures. We do a refraction, but in a trial frame instead of the machine, the phoropter that you often see in an eye clinic, and I'll go into that in more detail. We do a lot of assistive equipment prescribing. So if glasses are not getting you the level of vision that you want, we'll look at different equipment and technologies that could help your vision function easier. And then we also do a lot of service coordination to those many members of the multidisciplinary team that I previously spoke about. So when we take a detailed functional history, what are some of the things that we ask about? We'll ask about reading. Are you reading books? Are you reading on a computer? Things like that. We'll ask a lot about visual information. How is facial recognition, watching TV? We always ask about mobility. Were there any recent falls? How do you feel navigating in familiar and unfamiliar environments? We'll talk about activities of daily living and visual motor skills. So how is cooking going, cleaning, managing your medications? We always ask about driving. Are you meeting the driving requirements in your state, which do vary for every single state? And if you don't meet them, what are some alternative transportation options available for you? Additionally, we'll ask about living situation and how that's working, any job or educational goals. We'll ask about your existing technology and whether accessibility features are set up on that technology to make it easier for you to see. Some examples are smartphones and computers. And then, of course, we'll always ask about what you do in your free time and what your hobbies are. Now, some functional vision measures that I wanted to point out about the low vision exam. One thing I want to say is we have multiple charts for visual acuity. So sometimes on the traditional visual acuity chart where they project the letters to the screen, you may not be able to see the largest letter at times. And so sometimes people will have you count fingers or things like that. In our low vision clinics, we have different charts that go to even larger letter sizes so that we can get a concrete numerical value for your vision, even if maybe that standard vision chart isn't quite large enough for you to see. Again, as I previously mentioned, we will measure your contrast sensitivity or things as they become dimmer. We'll also do a reading assessment. And what that is that's the card here that I'm pointing to with the mouse. But this is an MN read card. It's a continuous text card. So, sometimes it's easier to see each individual letter and you can see really small letters alone. But when there's field loss, maybe it's harder to read a whole sentence because you're only seeing one letter at a time. And so this card lets us watch your fluency in reading and helps us better predict what could improve your reading. And then we'll also do visual field measures. Now the trial frame refraction that I mentioned. In the top, you see a picture of the trial frame that we'll put lenses in during this refraction. Below, you see the phoropter, the standard machine. What's a little different about a trial frame refraction? One is that the lenses that we will be showing you are directed by how small you see or your visual acuity, as opposed to in a phoropter where the steps are a little bit more standardized. Secondly, it's a little bit more of a natural environment. So you're able to look around, move your head as we check your glasses prescription. And third, it allows for eccentric view. So sometimes patients with glaucoma see a little better if they look slightly off to the side instead of directly at something. And you're able to do that when we're using a trial frame, but sometimes that's a little bit harder to do in the phoropter or the machine that we often do our general refractions through. Now, in our assistive equipment evaluation and prescribing, I'll go through some of the more common strategies that we sometimes employ in patients that are living with glaucoma, but there are many different options that we have based on functional goals. We can do higher powered reading glasses than your standard reading glasses. We have multiple different tints that we can do in different frames. We can do fit overs like this yellow one I'm circling here. Or we can do chemistry clips. These are clips that magnetically attach to the front of your existing glasses so that you can swap out your tints and cosmetically they match the glasses you already wear. There's multiple telescope options to improve distance viewing. Also, we can use Minifiers, and this I'll go into in more detail later, but it helps in patients with visual field loss. We can do all different types of magnification for near, whether that's a hand magnifier or stand magnifier. We can also do electronic magnification and contrast enhancement, so making things bolder and bigger. And that can be done in this picture here with CCTV technology that I'll go into a little more, or head-mounted displays, so displays that you can wear that work like virtual reality to make things larger and bolder for far away and up close. And then we can talk about assistive technology, even on devices you already have. So some examples of that are there's many apps that are free or low cost that you can implement on your smartphones or tablets. There's built-in accessibility to make font larger, contrast bolder, or even have things read aloud to you from current computers and smartphones. And so those are some things that we can also work with many different patients on. Now, as I mentioned previously, we do take a multidisciplinary approach. So maybe you come to your low vision exam, we find equipment or technology that's working well for you, but then we're going to employ the help of others. Maybe it's a low vision therapist, or I often refer to occupational therapists to come out to the home and do additional training, even after you're trained in our office. And so again, it's very important, and we coordinate with a whole team of people that work for you and work with your health when we're doing low vision rehabilitation. Now, some common rehabilitation approaches in glaucoma are minification, orientation and mobility, occupational therapy, the contrast enhancement options, magnification or making things bigger, and then altering the design of glasses. So minification or reverse magnification is when we're making things smaller so that more of a room or what you're looking at can fit into your seeing visual field. So if there's peripheral visual field loss and you're only seeing, maybe 20 degrees of field centrally, we can make it everything 3 times smaller so you can actually see about 60 degrees of a room instead of just the 20 degrees when you hold up a minifier. There's handheld options that are pictured in the middle here. We can also mount them to spectacles in a bioptic position so that you look below them traditionally, but then when you want to get a quick sense of more of the room, you'll dip your chin and look through the minifier. And so those are just some options for anyone living with severe visual field loss, especially in glaucoma. One caveat I want to tell you is you would never walk around with a minifier on all the time. It's used for brief spotting or surveying of rooms or crowded areas. The reason you wouldn't walk around it all the time is, yes, you can see 3 times more of the room, but everything's 3 times smaller. So it's really to survey an area, get a sense of an area, but you're not going to walk around wearing a minifier all the time. Now, orientation and mobility can be very, very important. We often refer to orientation and mobility specialists who are individuals that are trained specifically in helping people with effective travel in indoor and outdoor environments, especially with visual impairment, visual field loss, or legal blindness. They can help with searching skills or finding things more easily in different rooms. They'll teach sighted guide to those in your family or those that you're often with in case there's times you'd like a sighted guide to help you navigate. They do a lot with protective techniques. If indicated, they'll do long cane training to help with mobility that way. And then oftentimes they'll also do a lot of help with public transportation or navigating different transportation options. Occupational therapy are people coming in to help anyone with visual impairment or blindness through the performance of their activities in daily life. Some things that they'll help with in low vision could be reading and writing tasks, whether that's more training with the magnifier you're using, or using a line guide or typoscope as pictured here to help you track the lines. They'll also help with performing daily activities. So down here, you can see a picture of bump dots. These can often be used to mark like the 30-second button on a microwave to make the microwave easier to navigate. Or they'll help with using a magnifier or special glasses that we prescribe to help see the dials on an oven, things like that. A lot of the occupational therapists I work with also have a lot of training in technology, helping set up those accessibility features on your computer or smartphone, training with the different applications, voice readers, things like that. And then of course they can help with environmental and safety recommendations. And that's other things we'll talk about in the exam. But one example here is on the stairs, maybe marking the stairs in a dimly lit area with bright yellow tape so that they're easier to see and easier to navigate. Now, some of the technology I mentioned was the contrast enhancement or CCTV technology. And these are different devices that can both magnify, but also increase the boldness or contrast. There are desktop versions as pictured here. This is the Clearview Plus Speech by Optilec. This is the Adobe Acrobat. And what they can do is you can make the text larger, change the different colors and contrast. And then these both actually will also read aloud to you. So if you're tired of visually reading, it can use optical character recognition to read whatever book or whatever it's looking at aloud to you. Some CCTVs, like the Adobe Acrobat, have cameras that can also face distance. So they can magnify both the book sitting in front, and then you can turn the camera for distance if you were in school or working and wanted to see something on a board across the room. I also have several patients that will actually turn this camera towards them and use the magnified vision to put on their makeup or something like that. So really it can help with many different things. There are also multiple portable options. So you can see one portable option is a Ruby. This is a device by Humanware called the Humanware Explorer 5 and the Visilux by Eschenbach. The portable devices have many different size screens ranging, from 5 to 14 inches. And so obviously with a smaller screen, you can fit less words at a time, but these can be useful if you're going out to eat and want to see a menu, or if you need a portable option when you're not in your home with the larger desktop options. Head-mounted displays are another newer technology. They're very exciting. I have many patients that work with these. The two pictured here, the Iris Vision and the Patriot Viewpoint. What these do is they magnify things at distance and up close, and both of these actually can also read things aloud to you. I'm using that optical character recognition. They have a trackpad on the side to make things bigger or smaller and change through different modes and contrast modes. And I have patients use these for a variety of things, but they can be really helpful and versatile. I have one patient that loads documents into them and magnifies and does her work on it, but then quickly zooms out to see her toddler playing across the room to make sure he's not in trouble. I have other patients that wear them around their neck. You don't want to walk in them because the magnification can be disorienting. And then we'll hold them up to see different paintings and things at a museum, or to take a closer look when doing fishing. So they can be very useful and versatile, and there's many different brands and designs available. Then we can always make things larger. I highly recommend many different magnifiers that incorporate light, because light always helps increase contrast. There's hand magnifiers. This right here is the Macrolux, which is a dome magnifier that rests on the page and has a light built in. And so these can be really great options for reading, quickly spotting directions or food labels, things like that. And tints and lighting is always beneficial. Installing good lighting in your home, whether that means we recommend an occupational therapist to come out and help with the lighting, to help with directed lighting for reading, and gooseneck lamps are always a great option. or different tints to either enhance contrast like yellow or to improve glare control in different situations. Again, there's many different frames. They can be incorporated into your own glasses. There's fit over designs that block from the sides and top and bottom as well. And then there's these chemistry clips I use quite commonly where they magnetically attach to your existing glasses. And you can switch different tints. And this can be really helpful if you have one tint that you prefer outside in bright sunlight, but another when you're in the grocery store, making it easy to kind of swap your tints onto your current glasses. Another simple thing I wanted to point out is that lens design can be really important in glaucoma and is something we work a lot with in low vision rehabilitation. This right here is a progressive lens. So a lens that the top part's for distance and then there's intermediate or computer in the middle and then reading at the bottom. When you have a very constricted visual field or any visual field loss, sometimes it can be hard to find the sweet spot in your progressive glasses to improve your vision. And so oftentimes we'll actually transition to a single vision design or one where the whole lens is for the computer, where the whole lens is for reading. If you're going to be doing sustained work with those tasks so that you're not always trying to find that sweet spot, especially with any visual field loss. And then there are the many accessibility features and apps that I could do a whole presentation on. Some of my favorites, Supervision Plus is a free magnifying app on iPhone and Android that allows you to magnify, and you can also reverse contrast to make things white on black instead of black on white. Seeing AI is also a great app right now, only available on iPhone technology, although they say that Android technology will follow. This is a free OCR or read aloud app. So if you point it at a document, it will read it aloud to you. It can also scan barcodes of different soups or foods to tell you what they are. And it's working on being able to tell you if a person enters a room. I will tell you that feature is not the most accurate yet. And then Ira is another app that I'm very familiar with and really like. This has trained professionals that go through training on how to help individuals with visual impairment or blindness navigate. To have a subscription, it does cost money depending on the plan, but short calls are historically free. And different places are now incorporating Ira as an option for any of their visually impaired or blind patients. And so, for example, Logan Airport is an Ira site, so anyone can use Ira in there for free. Additionally, Starbucks allows the use of Ira. And so that's another really great option. And something that if it's something that could help you functionally, we would talk about during a low vision exam. So that is the complete presentation I have today. Thank you so much for having me. And I'll be here on the panel for any questions.
All right. Very good. Thank you, Allie. There will be a number of questions that I'm looking forward to asking about your presentation, and yeah, just so informative. But there's so many more questions that we'll be looking forward to your answers on. I'd like to move over now to James Knoll, who has expertise in really dealing with chronic low vision, both as someone who experiences low vision and as someone who helps others deal with this. And so I think we're getting a really wonderful balance here of both kind of the techniques that are used to help people actually see when their vision is decreased, but then there's that other really important element of how do we deal with that from an emotional and just functional perspective. And so, James, really interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. So I guess just a little bit about myself, as I am a therapist and have lived experience with a degenerative retinal condition. So not exactly glaucoma, but similar in that regard. And in terms of like the emotional experience and sort of working with any kind of chronic condition, but especially with these particular types, I think it's important to kind of understand the nature of the condition itself brings up this experience of grief, and particularly one of sort of perpetual grief and sort of anticipatory grief as you continue to lose vision, because it can either be, sudden or a kind of a slow thing. And typically that's accompanied with all of the things that come with grief, of course, like denial. Typically is, getting to know that you have this. For some people, it's a shock, and you don't necessarily have the knowledge in advance, if you don't have a family history. Even if you do have a family history, it's still, I think, time and again, still hardship, because it's not something that, we typically expect to happen in life. It can be very traumatizing because of that. And with that too, it also brings similar symptoms from like PTSD and things like that because of the experience itself. And it's different person to person, of course. Everybody has different ways in which they hold and carry these kinds of conditions and the ways in which they respond. And I'll get to kind of some of that later in terms of like how we can kind of cope with it. And then, of course, often it can be accompanied with like a lot of anger and fear, just fear around the condition and sort of, the uncertainty and ambiguity of it all, and trying to hold space for that, which is something typically we would want to work with, in a therapeutic sense. And then, of course, sometimes it can come with a lot of anger as well as often happens with grief and loss. There's can be a lot of feelings of why me, and as well within that too, just anger and frustration around the whole process, having to make such changes in your life, which are unexpected and never really wanted, and change is not easy. And I think too, sometimes there can be some anger and frustration with the fact that it is incurable, and that these conditions still are waiting for like more treatments in terms of like restoring vision. Of course, too, I think a big one as well is depression, anxiety. If you haven't had those symptoms before, some of those can often crop up. So, you might see some of the signs in terms of like sleep loss, or more sleep, things like that. You might see changes in your eating patterns, just not being as hungry or eating more. There's different ways in which people cope with it that might have kind of a more negative impact upon your mental health and physical health overall. And with that too, I think one of the biggest sort of defining features that I think, at least I've seen a lot in my own personal experience, and then just knowing people and speaking with others on these types of conditions, I think, is the loneliness and isolation that comes with it, because there aren't a lot of people that have these types of conditions, whether it's glaucoma or anything eye related. They're rare, and it's hard to network and find other people. It's getting easier nowadays with the internet and social media. But that said, finding a community of people can be difficult, and you may often have a lot of people around you and your family or friends who just don't understand, and that can be invalidating. Can be ways in which they minimize the pain that you might be going through and experiencing. And we might ourselves do that to ourselves as well. But there can be a lot of sort of self-isolating and just feeling disconnected, kind of alone in the world, as it were. And that can be one of the most detrimental to our mental health overall, and is, I think, a common one in this. And of course, I'll get to kind of one of the antidotes and kind of ways to work around that later. And I think really the only other major thing to kind of talk about is just the fact that the experience itself is traumatizing and can be. And I don't want to say that everybody has a trauma response to it, but often it can. And that might highlight or sort of exacerbate other previous mental health conditions. Say you had depression and anxiety before, it can obviously make it worse. Any sort of family of origin issues or any other PTSD you may have had in the past, traumatic experiences, those also might become heightened and kind of come back to the surface as well. And typically some of the negative, kind of moving into the negative ways in which people might react or kind of cope with it, I think there's a number people might turn to, substances or other addictive behaviors, things like that, just to try to kind of numb the pain, because these are really difficult experiences to hold, and just not a lot of people understand what it is like and what you're going through. And as I said before, isolating, things like that. The experience itself, I think when you're losing vision, has this tendency to kind of make you want to, maybe not necessarily make you want to, but parts of your life you just can't do as you were able to before. And so this restriction upon your independence and your autonomy, sort of your ability to kind of do whatever you need to do or whatever you want to do in the world, suddenly now shifts, and you can't do those things the way you used to. And it's not that you can't do all of those things. Many of them you still can. You just have to find different ways to do them. But it can take a while to get to that point to feel like you can. And some things, unfortunately, like we won't be able to do at some point. Like I think driving is kind of one of the biggest ones. And depending on where you live, that can be a really challenging aspect of your life. And then, of course, I think then just kind of wrapping into sort of what I have for the end is just how can we kind of cope with these things, and sort of try to understand the experience and kind of work towards holding these emotions and kind of processing the grief. It's obviously it's different for everybody. It takes time, and there are different ways in which people can do it. I'm a little biased as a psychotherapist, so I definitely recommend people seek a therapist out and get support that way, just for their mental health. It's always good, I think, to have somebody to talk to about these things and have emotional support, and to be able to help you move through and process the trauma of the experience or the grief and loss that you may be experiencing. And that can take many forms too. It doesn't have to just be an individual therapist. It can be group therapy. You can see a number of different things. You can do other different types of therapeutic approaches as well. It doesn't have to just be talk therapy. And I think another aspect too, in terms of kind of helping to cope in a positive way and kind of help with mitigating like the negative mental health impacts, I think actually is sort of an embodied movement. So getting to one, kind of be more in your body and sort of get out and move in the world and do those things that you still like to do, whether it's going for walks or whatever, even if it is difficult and more challenging than it used to be. There is an aspect to kind of getting up and moving that can be really helpful, and kind of getting our minds moving and distract us away a little bit from some of the intrusive thoughts that we might have from time to time. And just getting out and having that physical activity is really good for the mental health overall. There's tons of research that shows that. And then additionally, beyond that, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. Aside from that, I think also just hobbies, really exploring the things that you still love to do and not letting go of those, and really trying to find ways, if they have been impacted by it, to still do them, to still engage with those, because we don't want to lose those things. When we start to lose those parts of ourselves that we really cherished before and we really loved, those aspects of our lives, it also can negatively impact us further. And I think the other major one is sort of the social support part. Like I said before, family and friends may not be able to always understand, but I think most people do want to try to understand. And if we can help them understand and just find people in our lives who are really supportive and listen to us and hold space, holding on to them, I think is really good. And then within that too, I think I mentioned that with the internet, it is easier to start to find a community. And I think now finding a community with other people who are experiencing glaucoma, who are also experiencing low vision, can be really beneficial for you and the other person, because you're getting another person who has a similar experience. Even if it's not the exact same, there's a shared lived experience there, and that's incredibly important. And that can be so healing to just be able to talk to somebody else. And then if you are experiencing like the more like oppressive ends of depression, say like suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation, definitely also, suicide hotlines are always good to call. Definitely for support. There's warm lines also around the country just for emotional support. And I also recommend just getting anything and everything you can. And then I think one last thing would be like, I know we're going to talk about it, I think, in the panel as well, but mindfulness and meditation, things like that, those practices, yoga, those can be incredibly instrumental as well. There's a little bit of a complex situation that can kind of go on there, but I think it's really important to key in on that and sort of have that reflective space, and to be able to just try to sit with our experience and really try to understand what we're going through, and listen to, our hearts and our bodies. And I think that's it.
Well, thank you, James. It was very informative, and we're going to bring Tracy and Nina onto the panel now. And between those two wonderful talks, all that information, I really like to get some real life experience with that. James, you mentioned mindfulness meditation at the end of your presentation. It's interesting that there's been some recent literature to suggest that mindfulness meditation, which we've always known can be beneficial in terms of stress reduction, may actually help benefit glaucoma patients directly by lowering intraocular pressure. Seems to actually activate certain genes in the nitric oxide pathway, among other things that go on. Another recent study suggested that breathing exercises can help. And then yoga, not yogurt, but yoga, other than the positions that involve the head below the heart, such as downward dog, that yoga can also be a benefit. So, I'm interested, Tracy and Nina and James, all of you, in terms of, your own experiences. Do you meditate, practice yoga, and have you found it helpful in terms of, dealing with the chronic and acute stresses of having an issue or caring for somebody with, low vision? So Nina and Tracy, neither one of you have had a chance to speak yet, so I'm going to have one of you start this discussion.
I can jump in. Oh, go ahead, Tracy.
Go right ahead, Nina.
Okay, I'll go. So for my husband, Richie, he has low pressure anyway. So the yoga meditation wouldn't really affect that. But I certainly, both of us benefit immensely from meditation in the form of exercise, and also being in nature, and like even better if they're combined, like a long hike or going kayaking. That is absolutely kind of my primary source of stress relief, and I think it's his too. So absolutely. And then also like lifting really heavy weights, but that's not usually in nature. Maybe a tree stump.
And Tracy, your experience?
Sure. I haven't had any experience with yoga directly, but I do try to exercise often. I live in Washington, D.C. and in the city, so I live close to a gym. I try to get to the gym about 5 days a week, doing various exercises there. And then, James mentioned this as well. I've never been able to drive due to my vision. So I wanted to live in a place where I could be mobile. And so I walk around quite a bit when I run errands. I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to walk to work, those types of things. So I do get a lot of exercise on, if not every day, almost every day. And so I do think that obviously physically it has great physical implications, but walking or just going to the gym for an hour and putting your mind into exercise, I think has been very beneficial for me over the years.
Yes, and these are good points. That it's not just meditation, yoga. It's getting out and about. What's good, as I like to tell my patients, what's good for the heart is good for the eyes. And we're going to we've already talked about apps a bit. I'm sure we'll want to talk about that a little bit more. But I think it's also very important that we get away from those apps, right? You talked about walks outside. It's not going to help with stress if you're walking outside and constantly looking at your phone or whatnot. James, when you do recommend stress reducing activities to your patients, I know that meditation among some groups of patients can be a little frightening, or maybe they think it's a little woo-woo, or I was raised in a conservative Christian environment where meditation was actually considered to be a bad thing. How do you introduce this to your patients in a way that makes them comfortable pursuing something that could be of benefit to them?
That I think that's a really great question, because typically how I try to introduce it is present sort of the research on it and like show how it is beneficial. And then of course, if they aren't amenable to it, I'm not going to push it on them, but I might reintroduce it later on too. But typically what I like to do is actually guide them through it as an experience if they're open to it first, so that they actually get a touchstone experience with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's something that they feel good about on their own, they can, obviously go do it in their own life, or we can continue to do it. And then that's typically how I kind of do it. I never like to force anything on anybody or do a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
But
So that's and this last year has been interesting. What with COVID, many of the meditation sitting groups and instructors were not really available. But there are a number of wonderful apps out there. So moving on to the app discussion, certainly there are great apps for meditation for those who would like to do that. I'm interested, Tracy, what Ali mentioned some apps, and I do hope that the Glaucoma Research Foundation can provide links to those apps to those who have participated in this discussion among the attendees. But Tracy, what apps have you found to be of benefit?
Well, I have a couple that Ali actually said, and we did not coordinate this beforehand, but the Magnification app is obviously incredibly helpful, so that you don't have, for me anyway, I don't have to carry a separate magnifier or something else around, because you always have your phone on you. So there you go. You've got a magnifier. For me as well, the podcasts and audiobook apps that are out there are helpful as well, because it's, as many of us might have, it's difficult for me to read words on a page. So there are things I can do on computer screens with high contrast and other things that I read primarily for work and those things. But, ways to get information or be entertained without having to read something or watch something are very beneficial. So whether that's audiobooks, whether that's podcasts, whether that's, all the ways to listen to music now that were not available, 10 and 20 years ago. They're not necessarily vision specific, but I have gained an extraordinary amount of enjoyment and utility, out of, again, the audiobook apps, the podcast apps, the music streaming apps, those types of things have been incredibly beneficial to me.
That's a wonderful point, and that's actually transitions to a question that I had for Ali. You mentioned contrast issues with newspapers, and the first thing that I immediately thought of was how wonderful that now we can get all of our newspapers on either e-ink or our tablets, where it's high contrast, and you can squeeze out to increase the size and these wonderful things. you presented a lot of devices that looked quite expensive, and I think that in terms of whether or not they're covered by insurance, what are some of the devices and recommendations that you have for patients that are kind of off the shelf? So, for example, I mean, we all know about iPads, but iPads are not cheap. I've heard from a couple of user groups online that the Kindle Fire is an outstanding low vision device. Do you have any experience with that, or what would you recommend for those who are on a budget and, maybe looking for something to get them by until they can get insurance approval for other devices?
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of devices are difficult sometimes to get approved by insurance. Or it takes a while. So I file prior authorizations, but it often takes 3 or 4 weeks until I get the final approval from insurance and vice versa. Some off the shelf options, the Kindle Fire, I've had great experiences with. It does depend on the level of visual impairment. So the text only gets to a certain size on the Kindle Fire. So it can get larger with different devices, different large screen computer monitors, things like that. Another thing I recommend is if you have a laptop or a computer at home, get a second large monitor. High definition large monitors are often not as expensive as buying a whole new system, and are usually easy and compatible to hook up, can be ordered on Amazon. And those larger monitors, you can make things even larger on. So you can get larger letter sizes, more bold contrast. Same with the iPads and tablets, like the Google Chrome tablet. If you already have one, there's lots of free apps and built-in accessibility features if you go to the settings and accessibility tabs. But if you don't already have one, sometimes just working with your computer system and a large monitor or going with the device like a Kindle Fire is a good idea. But I always tell people with the Kindle Fire, try it in the store first to make sure it gets large enough for you. Because there is a subset of patients that we just can't magnify enough, even at their largest font size.
Right, very good. Well, thank you. So we are down to the last minute. Time has gone by so quickly. I want to thank everyone on this panel for participating. I'm going to leave the last 30 seconds with Nina, because the one thing we haven't talked about is from the caregiver's perspective. What is the one thing that you would say to those in the audience who are here for their loved ones with low vision that you could say that would be most helpful? In 30 seconds.
Oh boy. I would say, in addition to supporting emotionally and being kind of radically empathetic, doing the things to create the conditions for your loved one to continue to do the things that they love, which James mentioned, your hobbies and all of that. I mean, for supporting Richie, he loves to run. He's an avid runner. I also run, not quite as fast, but I'm, learning how to be a running guide and recruiting friends to learn how to do the same thing so that he can keep running as his vision loss progresses.
Yeah, that's such a good point that we need to remember something that all physicians need to remember, especially ophthalmologists. We get so focused on the eye. There's a person attached to that eye, and that individual has experiences and desires, and we can't just treat the glaucoma. We have to keep all of these things in mind. I want to thank everyone here. You said radical empathy. I think this has been a panel that really emphasizes empathy given the experiences on both sides that many have had. So thank you again.